Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reed, and today we are joined with my friend, Alexander Goel, who's the CEO and founder of Topology Health. Alexander, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Dylan. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're glad you're here. And to start off the conversation, how did you get into AI healthcare?
Yeah, so it's been a little bit of a twisty journey, but I worked for our provincial health agency here in Ontario, Ontario Health, for a number of years, and eventually went out and started doing my own thing.
Mhm.
And one thing I heard from a lot of colleagues was that integrating their AI-based applications into different kinds of health technologies was very challenging, whether that was integrating them to EHRs or integrating them to pull data from PAC systems. It's really hard to have the right set of knowledge to take your team away from working on your core value props. So we started Topology to try to address some of those gaps and help teams do their integrations much more faster and smoother than they could before.
Awesome. And what is the story particularly behind Topology Health? Was it was there a situation you working for a provincial health system, or was it just
Mhm.
kind of trends or opportunities that you saw kind of where the direction of AI healthcare was going?
Yeah, so we were I started working for the College of American Pathologists as a contractor after leaving Ontario Health, um,
Mhm.
and there I kept seeing colleagues, like I said, struggle with actually having tools to do the integration work that was written in the specifications or in the regulations that are in the 21st Century Cures Act. What we saw specifically was that there weren't developer focused tools for building those kinds of integrations, which is very valuable when you're connecting some kind of AI system to any kind of EHR or to, like I said, a PACS or any other kind of health IT system.
Mhm.
So I got together with my co founder, Josh, and we started Topology. We took a little bit of a twisty path to get where we are today, like most companies and most small businesses. Um, and yeah, eventually we've now settled on a product that is a very AI focused integration engine, and we've got several customers using it today.
Awesome. And specifically, kind of what you were saying about just the lack of AI integration tools, like were people before topology health came into being, like were they trying to develop it? Like, did people not, were they trying to, but they didn't have the skill sets, or
Mhm.
were you totally opening up a new, a new potential market with topology health?
Yeah, I would say that there were options for how to do integration before. There were definitely a lot of companies out there. I mean, still still are out there today that do integration or have access to health data, which is valuable for AI apps. But the way we're approaching it with integrating directly within the provider workflow,
Uh-huh.
I do believe that we offer some advantages, particularly for web-based AI applications, which are a lot of them today,
Uh-huh.
versus some of the existing options out there. Like Mirth is a really great tool. It's open source. It's been around for a really long time, um, but it's not as flexible and it's not as web ready, in my opinion.
Hmm. Awesome. And how many from like common AI based kind of web application tools? You said that there are many, but are there is the market in particular, is it like three or four that tend to dominate it, or is it kind of one that everyone uses, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few names in the integration space in general that you hear a lot. Mirth Connect is one of them. Um,
Huh.
Redox is another really big one. Rhapsody is huge. There's quite a few out there, and we'd be here a while if we named them all.
Awesome. No, totally get it. And that leads into my next question nicely. So Topology Health's goal is to make EHR integration painless. And kind of what I really like about that saying is you look on Topology Health's website and you're like, all right, I understand what their goal is, what their mission is. What does that mean to you though, as an executive at the company?
Yeah, are very we are very uh, strict about how we think about that. So what
Mhm.
we try to do with all of our customers is that we put together a process for how we're going to get them integrated, and
Uh-huh.
we try to approach each integration um, with a pretty custom focus because they're not all the same, and especially depending on your data needs, it can be really different. For example, maybe one AI application relies really heavily on images, and another one relies really heavily on narrative reports, and another one needs, you know, the problem list and medications and other data from the EMR. So we try to approach it from a use case first perspective,
Mhm.
um, and then build from there, and allow our tools to be set up and used in a way that really specifically targets and focuses on those needs of that app instead
Mhm.
of trying to do everything all at once, which we believe is a more efficient approach and is a more customer centric approach.
So it's like, so like as an example, like a healthcare organization would be like, hey, our EHR kind of needs X, Y, and Z. Um, can what? So do you have? I guess another way to phrase the question is: do you have clients that come to you guys and that they're like, I want this, this, and this, and then some are like, I have no idea what I want in my EHR. Can you guys help me kind of start from square one?
Yeah, exactly. And for a lot of clients, we're working with them who are working with their client, and
Hmm.
so we actually help them interface better with their client and make sure that they can communicate what data that they need, what APIs they need to hit, what services they'll need to set up, to make sure that that process is as smooth as possible.
Wow.
And
And
usually they'll come with a use case.
okay, and is there is there like a common kind of use case that you see, or is it kind of really depending upon the client and kind of what they need?
Yeah, it really depends. Like I said, Dylan, you might have one AI application that is fully image focused, and another one that's fully narrative text focused,
Uh-huh.
and another one that's like, generative, like an AI scribe, for example, or chatbot. And for all those kinds of use cases, it's very different what the data needs are,
Hmm.
and that's how we like to architect and build a solution. So we've got a lot of components that we've pre-built that are open source,
Hmm.
available on our GitHub, and then you can, you know, get us to help you fit them together in the right places so that you can solve your integration challenge.
Awesome. And the next question I have is, why is API integration so valuable for AI?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and it's one that we're seeing across multiple industries
Hmm.
where integrating AI into different kinds of applications is a time saver.
Hmm.
Um, I think Microsoft Copilot's a really good example of that, where it's directly in Word, so you don't need to copy and paste between Word and another application. So a lot of people like it for that. Um, and it's really the same thing if you're working with, uh, like I said, an AI scribe. It's an easy example to pick on since it's very common. Um, or if you're working with any other kind of AI app, flipping between apps, you can often lose users. It's harder to get people onboarded. Um, and that's just from an app integration perspective. From an API perspective, you want to be able to send uh, orders maybe to your AI application. So you actually want your AI application to do something. And maybe the physician or the nurse can order from the EHR. Uh, Maybe you want the AI application to read something in a patient portal
Hmm.
and translate something, make it more understandable for the patient. Then you need that AI embedded directly in that service. So adding that kind of context and giving AI that data that it really needs to make better recommendations, especially if you're driving like a clinical decision support use case where you're making a recommendation about what should be done with a patient, is really valuable and makes them safer.
Hmm. And this is just more of a kind of a curiosity question I have. So like with Meta, with Llama, and then like Google and Gemini, and
Mhm.
then those are kind of like the big two. Is the reason why kind of those two respective companies, and I'll add Microsoft in there too, have been able to kind of really get a head start on just kind of the AI field in general, was because they already had a lot of these APIs kind of on the back end that they could just successfully integrate with whatever model that they were trying to build?
I don't know if that's really the case, and I'm sure you'd have to ask somebody from each one of those companies to find out.
Uh-huh.
But my best guess would be that they didn't necessarily have the APIs, but they had access to the data they needed to train those models.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I see people in my circles often underestimate, is how important that data is to train those models. And that's why I believe that API access and API connections for AI is very valuable, because then
Mm-hmm.
you can give them context on, what they're actually looking at, what they're actually making recommendations on.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because it's like, you know, it's just amazing to me, just like how much data those two respective companies actually have. Like I
Yeah.
think I've had Facebook. I think I made a Facebook in like the eighth grade, so I'm like in middle school. So I can't imagine kind of how much data kind of Meta probably has on me within, what is that, 15 years ago now? Yeah, like at this point. And that's just from one person. And I think the last time I checked, there's, I think close to, I could be wrong, but the last estimation I heard was that there's like 1 billion people or something using Meta or like Meta related products. So I can't imagine like how much data just even one person from that billion can actually create for that
Yeah.
organization. Um, but yeah, I came across an article that Canada is actually looking to kind of be a player in kind of the being a responsible adopter of artificial intelligence. And so my question to you is, how do you see topology contributing to the greater conversation of Canada trying to be a responsible adopter of AI and kind of the greater AI healthcare community?
Yeah. And I think that we have a really important role to play, and actually all companies in our space doing integrations have a really important role to play,
Uh-huh.
uh, which is helping these AI applications behave in a responsible way. And
Mhm.
we can help with that by ensuring that the appropriate security is in place when data is being sent to and from those AI applications. We can help test and validate those applications by making sure that they can get connected to the right kinds of sandbox platforms. And like I said, we can help make those applications make the most informed recommendations that they can
Mhm.
by providing them appropriate context uh, on a patient that they might be looking at. Like imagine an AI making a recommendation to a physician about what could be done with a patient without knowing all the medications that the
Mhm.
patient's on. Like that's an insane proposition if you were getting a second opinion from another physician,
Mhm.
or as most people want to talk about these applications more like autopilot.
Mhm.
Imagine if your autopilot didn't have some of the parameters it needed to land the plane,
Yeah.
right? It's
Uh-huh.
it's scary. So
Mhm.
we, as these integration companies, have a responsibility to help these applications act safely.
Mhm. Yeah. And has there been, because I'm not Canadian, like have there been like I would call them like focus groups, or have they had like meetings kind of in Ottawa where they include
Mhm.
companies like Topology, where they're like, hey, we don't know what we're doing, but kind of what is the, how do we do API integration to make sure all of our citizens are safe? Like have those conversations been talked about or discussed?
So I'm really biased in this matter, of course,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um, given my personal and financial interest.
Yeah.
Uh, but I haven't seen that many. We're also
Mm-hmm.
a pretty small fish, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure how we would even get invited. Uh, but I've seen a lot of the discussion focused on how to make AI behave appropriately, and I think that's part of the conversation, but it's slightly different than how do we connect AI securely
Mm-hmm.
to health data. Um, and I believe that there's already really good regulations in place,
Mm-hmm.
and I do think that some of those regulations need updating for the modern context and for these AI applications for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the frameworks exist, but they're they're not all as clear as they could be for these kinds of technologies. And even, there's lots of complaints about and challenges, I'd say, with how even non-AI software behaves um, compared to, say, a medical device, with
Hmm.
many kinds of regulations around privacy and security. Um, or how do you compare a fax machine to a software as a medical device in terms of privacy and security?
Hmm.
Uh, and I'm really curious to see more of that kind of conversation happening, and including AI in that conversation
Hmm.
around, okay, we have these frameworks today, like HIPAA, for example, or in Canada we have PIPEDA, and then each
Hmm.
province has their own privacy legislation. And then how do we now expand that so it can be actually accommodating of these new platforms?
Hmm. So about Pipita, so it comes from Ottawa, and then does each province kind of have their jurisdiction of like how they want to enforce Pipita kind of on like for example, would Quebec have um jurisdiction of how they want to apply it to like Montreal, same thing in Ontario, Toronto, or kind of how does that work?
Oh, I do not feel qualified to talk about that. You definitely need a privacy specialist uh, to describe how that works. But I know for us, like how we behave as a company, is
Hmm.
that we look at all the requirements that are in PIPEDA, which are, I would say, are fairly general, and then
Uh-huh.
PHIPA, which is PHIPA in
Hmm.
Ontario, gives us specific, I would say more specifics about what things we need to do. Um, I would say it's quite a different model from HIPAA in the US,
Hmm.
where it's just like you can self-declare HIPAA compliance, and here are all the controls you need to put in place in order to do that. Um, so it's a little bit more, province to province. You got to make sure that if you're deploying an app in Ontario and then you're deploying in Quebec, that you're following each provincial guideline.
Hmm. Yeah, because it's interesting. Yeah, because kind of in the United States right now, you know, we're still trying to figure out kind of like what frameworks to apply, and I remember we were having a conversation. Getting a bill passed here in the United States, like that's 10 to 15 years, and by
Oh
the
yeah.
time the bill gets passed to solve one problem, you already have 19 others that you have to worry about at that. It just from like a because technology just changes, not even from a year to year, but even from week to week, or even day to day, just kind of how fast everything's going now.
Yeah, and like I was alluding to, a lot of these regulatory frameworks haven't even kept up with modern web applications, let alone AI-driven web applications.
Hmm.
So it'll be really interesting to see how they change, and it'll be really interesting to see um, what kind of new regulations or even regulatory bodies come out of
Hmm.
uh, the different departments to actually take ownership over
Yeah,
uh, these laws.
yeah. And and maybe it's just me, but it's like with HIPAA. So HIPAA was passed in the United States in 1996, so a good 30 years ago at this point.
Mhm.
I guess, well, 28 if you're kind of really counting, but rounding it up to 30. But still, that was before we had iPhones, we had apps, we had the technology for you and I to be kind of having this conversation on video.
Mhm.
Um, and nothing is really, I mean, we've here in the US, like we've had conversations about kind of like what is responsible AI, like how do we make sure that the AI doesn't behave maliciously. But aside from those kind of buzzwords and those kind of, I would say, superficial conversations, there hasn't been a lot of change from a policy standpoint here in the United States.
Yeah, I would say it's the same in Canada, and from what I've heard from colleagues around the world, it's pretty similar.
Uh-huh.
A lot of this legislation, from what I've seen,
Hmm.
hasn't evolved that much. Um, but I wonder, there are definitely some countries who are usually more forward leaning on that. Like the European guidelines to GDPR is totally different, and they've got a lot more. I would say they've got a lot more thought into
Hmm.
um, how this, like, how software behaves and how web apps
Yeah.
behave. Um, but still, yeah, I don't even think that they're caught up to
Hmm.
you know what happens when an AI just processes your whole health data, all of your health data?
Yeah, no, definitely. And there was a, and here in the U.S. too as well. Um, Part of it too as well as like, should this be? We also have the, regardless of where you lean on the aisle here in the US, but it's like, should this be a federal issue or should this be a state issue? So, we
Yeah.
also have that added layer of complexity too, as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
which,
Very familiar with that. I mean,
yeah,
in the Canadian context, like I would say, each province has their own way of deploying their privacy legislation and also their broader health mandate.
hmm
So we end up facing a lot of the same problems, just in a different flavor, I guess.
yeah. Well, and I also think too, as well, like legit, like going to, 'cause a lot the arguments that I hear, it's like, oh, well, why can't we be like Europe? And, yet again, Europe's not a country. So it's like, it's a continent. So it's like, do you want to be like Italy, Germany, Austria? So it's like, well, which country do you want to be like? But then also too, from a logistical side, you know, what works in one country, in Europe, and I'm just saying, Germany, which it has the largest, I believe, the last time I checked, um, that we have like close to 400 million people here in the U.S. So that's at least, you know, we have 4 times the amount of population from like the average European. So I just from like a logistical standpoint, like how do you make sure that you have the
Mhm.
same that the data privacy laws would have the same you know the same impact, even if the population is greater. And
Mhm.
that's not an easy thing to really. That's not an easy question to answer.
Yeah, and I do wonder also, from a commercial standpoint, it's pretty, I would say, advantageous to have a clear federal mandate,
Uh huh.
because then you know how to behave across more jurisdictions.
hmm
Um, so yeah, like from a vendor perspective, it's much easier to say, oh yeah, we comply with HIPAA, and then your operations are a little bit more streamlined. I wouldn't say perfectly streamlined, but it's one less thing to worry about state to state.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, because I was reading something recently, and what is it? It's I think so. The 49, I think the study was saying that, so 49, they call them like chief information security officers in the states, plus in the District of Columbia, basically like they're at like a budget shortfall when it comes to like cybersecurity. And it's,
Yeah.
what is it, 21 states use some sort of AI, form of AI, and like 22 are expected in the next year to use some sort of AI. So basically the majority of your states by next year are going to start using AI. And if you don't have like the funding to actually, actually make sure the data is like secured, like that's a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like you see really big companies get
hmm
caught, storing passwords in plain text all the time,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. No. And I think it's, and I think part of it too, and I don't think this is all of it. It's a generational thing. Like the people who tend to run the larger healthcare organizations tend to be older, tend to not tend to, and I'm not saying, I'm not saying all, I'm saying tend to uh, come from a generation where the internet was not as prevalent as it is. So I just think like from just an AI integration perspective, and happy to hear your thoughts. It's just gonna it might take a generation or two to actually fully kind of get a grasp on this technology.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting right now because AI is super buzzy,
hmm
which is why we're here, why you have this podcast, right?
Yeah.
But it's I think it's really changing how fast this technology is getting deployed compared to how I've seen other technologies get deployed in healthcare.
hmm
Um, Healthcare is typically like 10 to 20 years behind other industries on how technology is being used. Um, but there's definitely a lot of regulatory change, particularly in the US, with how connectivity between these systems is working and how that's reshaping the market.
Mm,
and how, I would say, interested and how much pressure there is on the industry to make substantial changes to how healthcare operates.
mm,
Um, so, in looking for solutions, I wouldn't be surprised if AI is faster adopted than we've seen other technologies in healthcare. And
mm,
I wonder how controversial of an opinion that is.
mm. Well, and see you bring up an interesting point though, because this is something that I've thought about too. Like, is part of it, do you think that healthcare tends to be like more litigious than other industries, which is why it's been kind of what you're saying, the 10 to 20 years behind that technological curve?
I think that's one aspect. I think broadly speaking, it's mainly the risk aversion,
Hmm.
and it's really driven by fear.
Uh-huh.
I would say the litigiousness is one aspect of that, or one way that this fear is manifested and created.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I wouldn't say that I know exactly what specific thing has created that culture, but it's
Hmm.
certainly, in my opinion, a cultural thing in healthcare that I've seen, where there's a aversion to new technology until you've seen it work.
Hmm.
And I would say part of that is because you haven't seen it work in a safe way.
Hmm. Yeah. I, being in having experience in a hospital, I've seen them like, we still in the United States in our hospitals still use fax machines to
Mm-hmm.
send stuff. And, whoever's older watching or listening to this podcast, I don't even know how to use a fax machine. So like, just to tell you, like, a technological divide, I'm like, oh, all you got to
Yeah.
do is just email them or scan PDF it and like, you know, send it off. Not like faxing. I was like, what's this fax machine that people still use? But
Yeah.
um,
I mean, I'm in the same boat, Dylan. And first job I had to learn how to use the fax machine. I had to get somebody to write me instructions because I literally didn't know how.
yeah. Well, and I've been in experiences where I've had to scan things. So it's like who's scanning things anymore? Like really? It's but I mean, yeah, no, on a serious note, like it's crazy how much, here in the I mean, I can speak the best for the US, but it's like how we have
Mhm.
so much technological innovations, but it's kind of that it's that seesaw approach where it's like, yeah, it goes up, but then you always have that other kind of force that tends to push it back down. So it's like this constant,
Yeah.
you know. And I just think, at the end of the day, um, this technology is not going to stop integrating. And I'm in the same boat, probably as you, where I would rather be ready for this integration and kind of have fun and kind of be on the bumpy roller coaster ride than kind of be left behind.
Yeah. And I think given the number of people who are using Facebook, like you talked about earlier, or using a meta product and on a daily basis, I feel
Hmm.
like a lot of people are prepared for that or have that kind of expectation.
Yeah.
Um, I've talked to a lot of patients who are shocked that we can't get them their entire medical history, or that their medical history isn't stored somewhere within their health network. Um,
Hmm.
but at the same time, you have to accommodate every person who is
Hmm.
not willing to share that information and wants their privacy protected.
Hmm. No, definitely. And I also think too, as well, part of I will say this, I don't think big tech is this big evil entity that we're making it out to be. I remember when Facebook was starting to get off the ground. What was that? 2006, 2007. So do you remember kind of that little arms race that MySpace and Facebook had for a little bit of time, like who could get more people on their site, and like eventually Facebook kind of overtook them. Um, so my does MySpace even still exist anymore? I
I
don't
have no
know.
idea.
But anyway, to
You'll
make
have
a
to
long
look it
story,
up later and put it in the show notes.
yeah, I'm like, this what's is MySpace still but yeah, I should. But yeah, no, it's very and that's the thing. It's like, did people not think 15 years ago when social media was starting to become like, hey, they're making me give my first name, my last name, my email address. They're giving me their Facebook pages to like. Like, what do you think was going to happen? Like, there has to be some sort of like consumer responsibility, and then you get into this argument of like, oh well, they're shutting down free speech, which don't, you could have an entire podcast conversation about that. Like, I just don't, it's I just don't I just think that it's basic. Like, they're not, what I'm trying to say is these big tech companies are not going out and being like, hey, give me your data or else. Like, there has to be some sort of uh Alex, I just think there has to be some sort of like consumer responsibility.
Yeah, I partly agree with you, Dylan, but I think I mostly disagree that it's all on the consumer. I think that there is certainly a responsibility
Uh-huh.
for these companies to behave appropriately.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we certainly see that in healthcare. If you have a third party collecting all your personal health data, I don't want them selling it to pharma. I just
Mm.
want, personally, me as a
Uh-huh.
patient, I want my physician to have access to my entire medical history.
Mm.
But I don't want the EHR they're using to sell all my data to a big pharmaceutical company without my consent.
Mm.
Um, and I feel like it is different when you're just talking about your Facebook like history,
Yeah.
but it's still your personal data, and
Mm.
I do disagree that it's all on the consumer, especially when you start scrolling through some of those privacy policies.
Yeah. So is the argument then, I'm just curious from learning from your perspective, is it kind of like, where does the conversation I mean, excuse me, where does the business responsibility start and kind of where does the consumer responsibility start? Is that fundamentally kind of where you think the debate should be going?
Um, I'm not sure that's where the debate should go.
Uh-huh.
I think that the debate should go straight to the business responsibility and how the businesses should behave, especially when you're talking about a digital health platform,
Uh-huh.
uh, which is processing and potentially storing your data. There should be rules around what they're allowed to use that data for, how they're supposed to store it, encrypt it, and there are like many of those practices exist today. Many of those are regulated things that these apps have to do. These manufacturers have to do, like, where is your cloud hosting region, for example. Um, Very important issues that I think need to be
Mm-hmm.
maintained in terms of the zeitgeist and what we're talking about, what we're focusing on. And I don't think that that should be on the consumer, in my opinion. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that every consumer has the time
Uh-huh.
to interrogate every app that they're using and say, is this app going to sell all my personal information, especially my health record?
Mm-hmm. So kind of like more transparency around kind of, if you agree to our terms of services, this is kind of what you should expect.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think also some really good enforcement and uh, understanding of where that data should go. I do think that there should be regulations in place uh,
Mm-hmm.
for how that data is shared and used. I We have them today, and I think that they need to keep existing and need to be continue to
Mm-hmm.
be enforced.
Awesome. And that leads into my next question nicely is, what do leaders need to understand about AI healthcare when enacting policies that directly impact the process of EHR integration? You kind of mentioned it earlier, but if could you
Mhm.
expand upon that?
Yeah, I mean, Dylan, I think this is the key question that a lot of um, health facilities need to be considering when they're deploying a new AI application.
Hmm.
They need to be looking at how the data is being stored, how it's being used, um, where it's being stored. Are they still in compliance with their responsibility as an organization? And there are tools for that. There are legal and policy tools that exist for that, as well as technical ones. So it's really about making sure all of the checks and balances have been hit and
Hmm.
appropriately implemented, um, so that you are in compliance and that you do maintain that safe environment for patient data.
Hmm. Awesome. And Alex, where can people learn more about you as well as Topology Health?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm regularly posting things about health data standards and integrating into different kinds of health information systems. You can also find us on our website, topology.health, and subscribe to our newsletter, stay up to date with what we're doing. Um, Connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. And be sure to subscribe to the AI Healthcare Podcast YouTube channel and also listen to the audio version of this interview on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. It was great to learn from you and your unique perspective.
Thanks, Dylan. Appreciate it.
Of course, this is Dylan Reed signing off.